The papacy represents history's most ambitious claim to spiritual authority. One man speaking for God to almost 1.5 billion Catholics across all continents. This extraordinary assertion of divine representation has shaped Western civilization at its foundations, influencing everything from university systems to international law, from artistic development to political frameworks. The papal office is the world's oldest continuously functioning institution, a remarkable feat of organizational survival that demands explanation beyond a simple historical accident. Our examination will peel back the theological assertions to examine the paradoxes at the heart of papal power. How did a religion founded by a crucified prophet transform into a hierarchical institution crowned by a sovereign pontiff? What mechanisms allowed papal authority to expand beyond spiritual matters into temporal dominion? How has this office simultaneously claimed absolute authority while adapting to revolutionary changes in our education? The papal enigma transcends simple categorization. To theologians like Augustine, the Pope represents Christ's vicar on earth, entrusted with the keys to heaven. To philosophers like Spinoza, papal claims exemplify human institutions masquerading as divine mandate. To psychologists like Jung, the Pope functions as a living archetype, embodying the human need for external spiritual authority. To economists like Adam Smith, the papacy operated as history's most successful transnational organization, maintaining unity through sophisticated institutional mechanisms. Our exploration will also include the scriptural paradox establishing papal legitimacy, Christ's simultaneous elevation of Peter as rock and rebuke of him as Satan. This foundational contradiction sets the pattern for the office's enduring tensions between servant and sovereign, between spiritual authority and worldly power, between divine inspiration and human fallibility. From this seed grows the institution that would eventually claim infallibility, while repeatedly demonstrating profound limitations. The papal story reveals how spiritual authority becomes institutional power, how charismatic leadership transforms into bureaucratic continuity, how theological claims enable political authority, how symbols create tangible influence. This process reveals not only Catholic history, but the fundamental mechanisms through which transcendent claims operate in material reality across human societies. Whether viewed as divine appointment or human construction, the papacy provides an unparalleled window into civilization's persistent questions about authority, representation, and transcendence. Its claims remain extraordinary: that God speaks through one man, that spiritual truth requires institutional protection, that ancient authority remains relevant in modern plurality. By examining these claims through multiple disciplinary lenses, we gain insight into the deepest structures of Western thought and the enduring human desire to bridge heaven and earth through institutional form. So walk with me. I am Irevelato. I reveal the secrets you deserve to know, the lives and stories of luminaries and gods, the keys to thinking and deciding for yourself how you want to live your life, the freedom that dogma will never teach you, the flexibility to be interdisciplinary and interconnected, the true love of knowing that you are one with everyone, not only with those you agree with. If you are new here, welcome. If this is not our first rendezvous, thank you for continuing to be here with me. And never forget that my mission is only relevant if you individuate and live an extraordinary life. By joining the Irevelato community, you become part of a collective dedicated to intellectual exploration, without dogmatic constraints. Your contribution sustains independent analysis that major institutions often cannot provide, work that illuminates rather than obscures, that questions rather than preaches, that reveals rather than conceals. Consider supporting this mission if you think it is important enough. Your patronage allows me to dive deeper, research more thoroughly, and maintain the intellectual independence these subjects demand. Join me as fellow travelers seeking clarity in a world of competing absolutes. Become part of the revelation. The keys await. The First Vatican Council of 1870 represents a watershed moment in the Church's self-understanding, the culmination of centuries of papal evolution and the definitive codification of papal supremacy as dogmatic certainty. If anyone says that the Roman pontiff has only the office of inspection or direction, but not the full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the universal church, or that he possesses only the more important parts, but not the whole plenitude of this supreme power, let him be anathema. With these words, what had been a contested theological opinion became a required belief. The council's timing proved significant, occurring precisely as the papacy lost its last temporal territories to Italian unification. As the Pope's physical kingdom vanished, his spiritual authority was declared absolute. This inverse relationship between diminishing temporal power and expanding spiritual claims characterizes much of modern papal history, suggesting compensation through dogmatic definition for political marginalization. The Council's articulation of papal infallibility proved even more consequential. When he speaks ex cathedra, he defines a doctrine of faith or morals to be held by the universal church. Such definitions of the Roman pontiff from himself, but not from the consensus of the church, are unalterable. This formulation carefully circumscribes infallibility within specific conditions. The Pope must speak ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals, while simultaneously placing these declarations beyond challenge. The doctrinal gymnastics required to justify this position historically are evident in the Council's strained interpretation of tradition, claiming to be adhering faithfully to the tradition received from the beginning of the Christian faith, despite the absence of explicit infallibility claims in early Christianity. Most revolutionary is the assertion that papal definitions derive authority from himself, but not from the consensus of the Church. This represents the final inversion of early Christian practice, where councils determine doctrine through collective discernment. The Council essentially declared that the Church's understanding of truth flows from the Pope downward, not from consensus upward. A pyramidal model that contradicts the more circular authority structures of the first Christian millennium. This dogmatic definition emerged within specific historical pressures. Beyond Italian unification's threat to papal territories, the Church faced challenges from Enlightenment, rationalism, democratic revolutions, and modernist theology. Infallibility offered a bulwark against these perceived threats, an unchangeable authority in a world of flux. The anathemas attached to each definition reveal the defensive posture behind these proclamations, wielding excommunication as protection against internal dissent. The theological implications extend beyond authority claims. By locating infallibility in the papal office rather than exclusively in the collective church, the First Vatican effectively transferred the Holy Spirit's promised guidance from the community of believers to a single individual. This shift fundamentally alters how revelation operates within Catholicism. Truth becomes identifiable through office rather than discernment, creating a theological shortcut that bypasses the messier process of ecclesial consensus building. The Second Vatican, 1962 to 1965, attempted to recontextualize these claims within a more collegial framework. The Council maintained papal infallibility, while emphasizing it exists alongside episcopal authority. This infallibility extends as far as the deposit of revelation extends, and resides also in the body of bishops, when that body exercises the supreme magisterium with the successor of Peter. Yet these qualifications did not fundamentally alter the decree of the First Vatican that papal definitions are of themselves, and not from the consent of the Church, irreformable. The Council introduced a crucial secondary obligation, requiring religious submission of mind and will, even to non-infallible papal teaching. This created a tiered system of authority, where even ordinary papal pronouncements demand internal assent, effectively expanding papal authority beyond the narrow constraints of ex cathedra statements to encompass virtually all papal teaching. The visual symbolism of papal authority similarly evolved without abandoning core claims. Pope Pius XII appears in the 1955 photograph carried on the sedia gestatoria, portable throne, wearing the triple crown tiara, symbols of absolute authority across spiritual and temporal domains, though Paul VI would later retire both practices, setting aside the tiara and ending the practice of being carried above the faithful. These visual accommodations to modern sensibilities occurred without corresponding modification of the underlying authority claims. The ongoing tension between the First Vatican's absolutism and the Second Vatican's collegiality remains unresolved in contemporary Catholicism. Jung and 60 prominent theologians' 2012 declaration that the intention of the Second Vatican Council to manage authority in the Church did not succeed highlights this fundamental contradiction. Their claim that misunderstanding and abuse affecting the exercise of authority has caused present-day stagnation suggests that the centralization of power of the First Vatican continues to undermine the vision of shared authority of the Second Vatican. This tension manifests practically in how modern Catholicism functions. While the Pope theoretically possesses full and supreme power, the practical limitations on enforcing universal compliance have led to diverse expressions of Catholicism worldwide. The gap between theoretical absolutism and practical diversity creates cognitive dissonance within Catholicism itself, formally committed to papal supremacy while pragmatically accommodating significant local adaptation. The infallibility doctrine, though narrowly defined, casts a long shadow over Catholic intellectual life. Though formally invoked only once, Pius XII's 1950 Declaration on Mary's Assumption, the possibility of its use creates a chilling effect on theological exploration of topics where future infallible declarations might foreclose debate. This produces a theological conservatism extending far beyond what the doctrine technically requires. The First Vatican's definitions represent Catholicism's decisive break from both democratic principles and ecumenical possibility. By centralizing ultimate authority in a single individual whose ex cathedra pronouncements stand beyond challenge, the Church created a system resistant to both internal reform and external reconciliation. The Council's declarations effectively transformed papal authority from a historically conditioned reality open to development into an unchangeable divine mandate, a transformation that simultaneously strengthened internal cohesion while complicating relationships with other Christian traditions. But let's dig deeper. The foundation of papal authority rests on a dramatic scene in Matthew 16, where Jesus bestows unprecedented spiritual power upon Simon Peter. "I tell you that you are Peter, and it is on this rock that I will build my congregation, and the powers of hell will not conquer it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom from heaven. Whatever you prohibit on earth will have been prohibited in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will have been permitted in heaven." This pivotal declaration establishes three elements central to papal claims: Peter as foundation, rock of the Church, the indestructibility of that Church against infernal powers, and the authority to bind and loose with heaven's ratification. The keys to the kingdom symbolism would later manifest visually in the crossed keys of the papal insignia, representing this divine commission to open or close the gates of salvation. Yet within moments of this exaltation, after Peter rebukes Jesus for predicting his suffering and death, Christ delivers a shocking counterpoint. "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, because you are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts." This whiplash transition from highest praise to harshest condemnation creates the fundamental tension within papal theology. The same Peter designated as the Church's foundation is immediately identified as Satan's mouthpiece, when his understanding turns from divine revelation to human preference, particularly when he resists the sacrificial nature of Christ's mission. The linguistic wordplay here is vital. The name Peter, Petros, means rock in Greek, creating a deliberate pun when Jesus says, "On this rock, Petra, he will build his church." This wordplay has fueled centuries of debate. Was Jesus founding his church on Peter himself, as the Catholics tell us? On Peter's confession of faith, as the Protestants believe? Or was the church founded on Christ himself as the rock Peter had just acknowledged, as alternative Protestant interpretations reveal? What is certain is that the grammatical ambiguity has theological consequences that persisted throughout Christian history. Also significant is that Peter's authority emerges only after his divinely inspired recognition of Jesus as Messiah. This suggests papal authority derives not from personal merit, but from supernatural insight and proper recognition of Christ's identity, a point further emphasized when Peter's satanic moment comes precisely as he fails to recognize the necessity of Christ's sacrificial mission. The Catholic tradition resolves the apparent contradiction by distinguishing between Peter's divinely guided office and his fallible humanity, while emphasizing the promise that the powers of hell will not conquer the Church, as guaranteeing some form of papal infallibility. Eastern Orthodox and Protestant traditions, conversely, emphasize the rebuke to argue that Peter's primacy didn't establish permanent institutional supremacy. Most significant is the nature of Peter's error, which is rejecting Christ's path of suffering in favor of worldly triumph. This prefigures the central temptation of the papacy throughout history, the substitution of temporal power for spiritual sacrifice. When medieval popes claimed universal dominion, commanded armies and crowned emperors, they functionally replicated Peter's error, thinking human thoughts of power rather than God's thoughts of sacrifice. The juxtaposition of these passages creates a profound theological warning embedded within the foundation of papal authority, that even the Church's designated rock can become Christ's stumbling block when institutional preservation replaces sacrificial mission. The holder of heaven's keys remains perpetually vulnerable to Satan's whisper that power, not sacrifice, should define Christ's Church. Jung's mystical experience through the Red Book reveals a deep revelation about papal authority. Jung writes, "Although I am not the son of the God myself, I represent him nevertheless as one who was a mother to the God, and one therefore to whom in the name of the God the freedom of the binding and loosing has been given. The binding and loosing take place in me. But in so far as it takes place in me and I am a part of the world, it also takes place through me in the world and no one can hinder it. It doesn't take place according to the way of my will, but in the way of unavoidable effect. I am not master over you, but the being of the God in me. I lock the past with one key, with the other I open the future. This takes place through my transformation. The miracle of transformation commands, I am its servant, just as the Pope is." Thus, Jung unveils the exquisite paradox at the core of papal identity. The Pope, adorned with the triple crown and vested with Christ's authority to bind and loose, is simultaneously the most powerful and most constrained figure in Christendom. What Jung brilliantly points out is not the elevated status of the Pope, but the theological tension inherent in the office, no matter who inherits it. The pontiff possesses the keys to past and future, which act as a metaphorical and literal power recognized in the papal insignia. Yet this power flows not from personal will, but through divine inhabitation. I am not master over you, but the being of the God in me, Jung writes, capturing the essence of papal authority as the vessel rather than the originator. The seductive mystery here lies in transformation. The Pope, transformed into Christ's representative, becomes the conduit for divine will, and his authority derives from his surrender to the miracle of transformation that commands while he, even in his exalted office, merely serves. This insight pierces the veil of papal politics and pageantry to reveal something far more profound. The Pope as servant to transcendent power, locked in the beautiful struggle between human limitation and divine authorization. Jung's comparison elevates our understanding into the realm where psychology and theology embrace in recognition of the sacred paradox at the heart of spiritual authority. To transform, the Pope surrenders to Christ with all his being. In his drafts to the Red Book, Jung continues, "The Pope in Rome has become an image and symbol for us of how God becomes human, and how he, God, becomes the visible Lord of men. Thus, the coming God will become the Lord of the world. This happens first here in me. The supreme meaning becomes my Lord and infallible commander, though not only in me, but perhaps in many others whom I don't know." In this passage, Jung moves beyond the Pope as servant to explore his function as living symbol. The Pope in Rome has become an image and symbol for us of how God becomes human and how he becomes the visible Lord of men. Here, Jung identifies the Pope's essential theological significance, earthly representation of divine incarnation. The pontiff serves as tangible manifestation of transcendence made immanent, embodying the paradox that defines Christianity itself. Divinity clothed in humanity. Jung then makes a remarkable conceptual leap. Thus, the coming God will become the Lord of the world. This happens first in me. The papal model of divine embodiment becomes a universal template. What occurs in the Pope as a symbol must occur within each psyche. The Pope's transformation into visible Lord prefigures a psychological process Jung sees unfolding within himself and potentially many others whom I don't know. This reveals Jung's deeper catch. The Pope is not only an ecclesiastical authority, he functions as an archetypal pattern of psychological and spiritual integration where the supreme meaning becomes my Lord and infallible commander. The papal office thus represents both institutional reality and psychological possibility, the embodiment of transcendent meaning within human form. Jung subtly transforms the Catholic doctrine of papal infallibility into a psychological principle where divine authority becomes internalized as supreme meaning, suggesting the Pope serves as an external symbol of an internal process of spiritual authority taking form within the psyche. Again, in the same Red Book, amidst his profound psychological explorations, Jung delivers a piercing critique of the papacy as a spiritual institution. This passage appears within Jung's confrontation with religious symbolism, where he interrogates how Christianity has contained and transformed authentic spiritual experience into institutional structure. But the Christian animals did not love your pagan humanity, since they felt in you what they needed. They always sought the branded one, and when they caught him somewhere in freedom, they locked him in a golden cage and took from him the force of his masculinity, so that he was paralyzed and sat in silence. Then they praise him and devise fables about him. I know they call this veneration, and if they do not find the true one, they at least have a pope, whose occupation it is to represent the divine comedy. But the true one always disowns himself, since he knows nothing higher than to be a man. Jung's critique cuts to the marrow of papal contradiction. The institution seeks not the fullness of humanity, but a controllable vessel to contain its projected needs. The branded one, once captured, becomes imprisoned in the golden cage of papal office, where his vital essence, the force of his masculinity, is neutralized, leaving him paralyzed in ornamental silence. What follows is compensation through mythology. They praise him and devise fables about him. This Jung dismisses as veneration, a hollow substitute for authentic encounter. When genuine spiritual presence cannot be contained, the institution creates its surrogate. At least have a pope whose occupation it is to represent the divine comedy. Jung's reference to divine comedy is almost certainly an allusion to Dante Alighieri's masterwork. This multi-layered reference deepens his critique. In Dante's Commedia, the cosmos unfolds as a divinely ordered spectacle with clear moral architecture. By suggesting the Pope simply represents this cosmic drama rather than embodies genuine spiritual presence, Jung implies institutional Christianity has reduced the transcendent mystery to a scripted performance or a theatricalized vision of spiritual order, where the Pope functions as actor rather than authentic vessel. The papacy is not the embodiment of divine reality anymore, but its dramatic reenactment, with all the artifice this implies. Most incisively, Jung contrasts this institutional papacy with authentic spiritual authority. The true one always disowns himself, since he knows nothing higher than to be a man. The ultimate paradox emerges. True divinity manifests not through elevation above humanity, but through its complete embrace. The Pope's elaborate separation from ordinary experience becomes not a mark of spiritual attainment, but evidence of its sacrifice. Here, Jung reveals the most profound contradiction of the papacy. Its ornate symbology functions not to manifest divine presence, but to compensate for its absence, substituting institutional authority for the raw encounter with the sacred, found in embracing one's complete humanity. Last but not least, in Appendix B of the Red Book, Jung explores the foundational mythology that underlies papal authority. In the latter case, the eye is depicted as Peter, the chosen rock upon which the church is to be founded. The key as the symbol of the power of binding and loosing buttresses this idea and leads one to the image of the Pope as God's governor on earth with a threefold crown. Here Jung traces the psychological lineage of papal authority to its scriptural root, the identification of the self, the I, with Peter, the apostle designated by Christ as the foundation for his church. This origin story establishes the essential legitimizing narrative of the papacy, direct succession from the chosen rock himself. The symbolic transfer of authority through the key represents the transmission of Christ's power to bind and loose, which means to determine what is permitted and forbidden, a power the Pope claims as Peter's heir. This symbol not only supports papal authority, but also buttresses it, being the structural reinforcement for the entire edifice of ecclesiastical power. Jung's progression from rock to key to threefold crown reveals the evolution of papal identity from humble apostle to imperial sovereign. The transformation of Peter the fisherman into God's governor on earth illustrates how spiritual authority becomes institutionalized as political power. The triple crown, tiara, visually completes this metamorphosis, clothing apostolic succession in imperial symbolism. What Jung illuminates is how papal identity depends on this symbolic chain of inheritance, from Christ to Peter to Pope, to maintain its legitimacy. The Pope becomes the living embodiment of this unbroken lineage, deriving authority from his position as both heir to Peter and representative of Christ as God's governor on earth. In his theological political treatise, Baruch Spinoza delivers a precise critique of papal authority by comparing it to the Jewish high priesthood. As to the tradition of the Pharisees, we have already declared that it lacks consistency, while the authority of the popes of Rome stands in need of clearer evidence. This is my only reason for impugning the latter, for if they could prove it from Scripture itself with the same degree of certainty as did the Jewish high priests of long ago, I should not be influenced by the fact that among the popes there have been found heretics and impious men. Among the Hebrew high priests too in the past were found heretics and impious men who gained the priesthood by underhanded means, and yet by scriptural sanction they possessed the supreme power to interpret the law. See Deuteronomy chapter 17 verses 11, 12 and chapter 33 verse 10, and Malachi chapter 2 verse 8. But since the popes can produce no such evidence, their authority remains highly suspect. Spinoza's challenge is methodical and devastating. The Jewish high priests, whatever their personal failings, possessed scriptural sanction for their supreme power to interpret the law, their authority derived explicitly from biblical texts Spinoza directly cites. The popes, by contrast, can produce no such evidence for their claimed supremacy, rendering their authority highly suspect. Spinoza continues with a crucial distinction. The example of the Jewish high priest ought not to deceive one into thinking that the Catholic religion also stands in need of a high priest, for it should be noted that the laws of Moses, being his country's civil laws, necessarily stood in need of some public authority to uphold them. If every man were free to interpret the civil laws as he chose, no state could survive. By that very fact, it would be instantly dissolved, and public right would become private right. Here, Spinoza distinguishes between Mosaic law as civil laws requiring public authority and Christianity, which he implies needs no such central interpreter. The papal institution thus represents a confusion of categories, inappropriately applying a political necessity to a spirituality that asks no such mediation. This passage reveals a fundamental challenge to papal legitimacy. Without an explicit scriptural foundation, papal claims to interpretive supremacy represent a human institution. Spinoza implies that papal authority derives not from divine right, but from political expediency. A human construction masquerading as a divine mandate. The contrast with Jung is revealing. While Jung explores the psychological and symbolic dimensions of papal authority, examining how the Pope functions as a vessel of divine will or an archetypal pattern, Spinoza attacks the foundational claim to scriptural legitimacy itself. Jung accepts the papal office as psychologically significant, regardless of its institutional basis, whereas Spinoza reveals the papacy as a theological construction, lacking the very textual evidence upon which it claims to stand. Where Jung finds psychological truth in papal paradox, Spinoza finds logical inconsistency in papal pretense to scriptural authority. Spinoza then extends his critique of papal interpretive authority to its logical conclusion. It is then far from true that the authority of the Hebrew high priest in interpreting his country's laws enables us to infer the Pope's authority to interpret religion. On the contrary, a more obvious inference is that the interpretation of religion is vested above all in each individual. And this again affords further proof that our method of scriptural interpretation is the best. For since the supreme authority for the interpretation of Scripture is vested in each individual, the rule that governs interpretation must be nothing other than the natural light that is common to all, and not any supernatural light, nor any external authority. Nor must this rule be so difficult as not to be available to any but skilled philosophers. It must be suited to the natural and universal ability and capacity of mankind. Here, Spinoza delivers his most radical assertion. The very precedent Catholics cite to support papal authority, the Jewish high priesthood, suggests the opposite conclusion. The interpretation of religion is vested above all in each individual. This represents not simply a critique of papal claims, but a complete inversion of Catholic ecclesiastical structure. Spinoza grounds this democratic interpretive approach in the natural light that is common to all, human reason itself, rather than any supernatural light or external authority. Scripture becomes accessible not through hierarchical mediation, but through universal human faculties. The text should be understood through reason suited to the natural and universal ability and capacity of mankind, not through specialized theological training or institutional authority. This passage reveals Spinoza's revolutionary religious epistemology. The Pope's claimed monopoly on scriptural interpretation represents not divine arrangement but human usurpation of individual interpretive rights. Scriptural meaning becomes available through direct engagement guided by natural light. Spinoza thus challenges not just papal authority, but the entire concept of mediated revelation. Where Catholicism positions the Pope as a necessary intermediary between text and believer, Spinoza asserts the primacy of individual reason in religious understanding. The papal office becomes not just questionable, but fundamentally unnecessary, an artificial barrier between believers and texts. They are fully equipped to understand through their rational faculties. This democratic theology represents a far more fundamental challenge than mere questions of papal legitimacy. It attacks not just the Pope's scriptural warrant, but the very premise that any external authority is needed to access religious truth. For Spinoza, the papacy represents not just an institution lacking scriptural foundation, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how humans access religious meaning. In the same treatise, Spinoza traces the historical evolution of papal power. Every age has seen such instances, of which I will quote only one, as typical of them all. The Pope of Rome, being granted this right absolutely, began gradually to establish his ascendancy over all the kings until he actually attained the pinnacle of dominion. Here, Spinoza identifies the crucial mechanism of papal power accumulation. The Pope, being granted this right absolutely, the exclusive authority to interpret Scripture, transformed a theological privilege into political dominance. What began as religious authority gradually extended beyond ecclesial boundaries to establish ascendancy over all the kings. Spinoza's language is precise and damning. The movement from religious interpreter to political sovereign was not sudden but gradual. A slow, deliberate expansion of jurisdiction from spiritual to temporal realms. This creeping authority eventually reached the pinnacle of dominion. The Pope is positioning himself as emperor above emperors. This historical observation reinforces Spinoza's earlier theoretical critique. The papal claim to exclusive scriptural interpretation lacks biblical foundation. It is the essential lever for accumulating political power. Religious authority becomes the gateway to temporal control. Spinoza presents this trajectory as typical. Not an aberration, but the predictable outcome when interpretive monopoly is granted to a single institution. The Pope's case serves as an exemplar of a universal pattern. Exclusive religious authority inevitably seeks political expression. This passage reveals Spinoza's understanding of ecclesiastical power dynamics. The papacy represents a political project, one that systematically converted religious authority into worldly dominance. Where Jung might see psychological symbolism in the papal triple crown, Spinoza perceives the material culmination of power consolidation. The visible evidence of successful political ambition is cloaked in religious legitimacy. For Spinoza, the Pope's historical trajectory from religious interpreter to political sovereign demonstrates precisely why interpretive authority must remain vested in individuals rather than institutions. The alternative is theologically unsound and politically dangerous, leading inevitably to theocratic overreach and the subordination of secular authority to religious power. In this letter to Alfred Berg, Spinoza delivers a pointed assessment of papal authority's historical development. If you will pay attention to these things and also examine the histories of the Church, of which I see that you are quite ignorant, so as to realize how false are many papal traditions and through what turn of events, and with what craft the Pope of Rome finally gained supremacy over the Church 600 years after the birth of Christ, I have no doubt that you will at last recover your senses. Thus, Spinoza strips away theological justifications to expose the papacy's political evolution. His claim that the Pope of Rome finally gained supremacy over the Church 600 years after the birth of Christ directly challenges papal claims to unbroken apostolic succession from Peter. Instead of divine institution, Spinoza presents papal supremacy as a historical development and the culmination of human craft and political maneuvering. The reference to 600 years after the birth of Christ points to a specific historical turning point, likely referring to Pope Gregory the Great, 590, 604 CE, or the aftermath of the Council of Chalcedon, periods when papal authority significantly expanded. Most damning is Spinoza's characterization of this ascendancy as achieved through craft, suggesting calculated political strategy rather than spiritual authority. He dismisses many papal traditions as simply false, products of political construction rather than authentic Christian inheritance. This passage reveals Spinoza's evidence-based approach to undermining papal claims. He directs Berg to a historical investigation, confident that objective examination of ecclesiastical history will reveal the manufactured nature of papal supremacy. For Spinoza, the Pope's claim to be Christ's vicar and Peter's successor represents a successful political consolidation, a human institution cloaked in divine legitimacy. This historical critique complements his philosophical objections by revealing the papacy as a product of specific historical circumstances rather than a timeless divine mandate. In a single penetrating observation from the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith reveals an overlooked dimension of papal power: control over Europe's intellectual infrastructure. The present universities of Europe were originally, the greater part of them, ecclesiastical corporations, instituted for the education of churchmen. They were founded by the authority of the Pope and were so entirely under his immediate protection that their members, whether masters or students, had all of them what was then called the benefit of clergy. That is, were exempted from the civil jurisdiction of the countries in which their respective universities were situated, and were amenable only to the ecclesiastical tribunals. Smith reveals how papal authority was not concerned only with spiritual domains, but also created parallel legal and educational systems throughout Europe. By establishing universities as ecclesiastical corporations under direct papal protection, the pontiffs constructed an intellectual archipelago operating beyond the reach of secular authorities. The benefit of clergy placed university communities outside civil jurisdiction, creating autonomous zones answerable only to church courts. This arrangement transformed educational institutions into sovereign papal territories scattered across diverse European kingdoms. ensuring the Pope maintained direct influence over the continent's intellectual development regardless of political boundaries. How convenient, isn't it? This observation complements both Jung's symbolic analysis and Spinoza's political critique. Where Jung examined the Pope as theological vessel and Spinoza questioned scriptural legitimacy, Smith reveals the material infrastructure of papal influence, which acted as a network of knowledge, producing institutions that extended papal jurisdiction into the intellectual formation of European elites. The universities were a masterstroke of papal strategy. By controlling education, the papacy shaped both the religious doctrine and the intellectual frameworks through which Europeans understood law, medicine, philosophy, and natural science. This hegemony provided far more subtle and pervasive influence than political dominion alone could achieve. Smith's economic lens reveals what religious and philosophical analyses might miss: how papal authority constructed institutional frameworks that survived even when spiritual allegiance waned, embedding Catholic intellectual frameworks into the foundational structures of European thought, regardless of subsequent religious upheavals. Smith unveils the military genius behind papal dominion, a system more sophisticated than a secular empire. Through the greater part of Europe, the Pope gradually drew to himself first the collation of almost all bishoprics and abbacies, or of what were called consistorial benefices, and afterwards, by various machinations and pretenses, of the greater part of inferior benefices comprehended within each diocese. The clergy of all the different countries of Europe were thus formed into a sort of spiritual army, dispersed in different quarters indeed, but of which all the movements and operations could now be directed by one head and conducted upon one uniform plan. Here, Smith reveals the structural architecture of papal power, a brilliantly designed transnational organization that transcended political boundaries through strategic control of clerical appointments. By gradually centralizing authority over consistorial benefices and later inferior benefices, the Pope assembled a hierarchical command structure responsive to Roman direction while embedded within every European kingdom. This spiritual army operated as coordinated detachments that functioned simultaneously as local institutions and branches of a unified international force. Unlike conventional armies constrained by geography and sovereignty, this papal force existed legally within, yet institutionally beyond the control of European monarchs. Independent of the sovereign of the country in which it was quartered and by which it was maintained, but dependent upon a foreign sovereign. The military metaphor illuminates the Pope's unique geopolitical position. While emperors controlled contiguous territories through direct force, the pontiff commanded a distributed network that penetrated every kingdom simultaneously. This design created leverage disproportionate to the Vatican's physical territory. Any European sovereign challenging papal authority might find an organized opposition operating legally within their own borders, supported and seconded by all the other detachments quartered in the different countries round about. Smith's analysis complements both Jung's symbolic interpretation and Spinoza's scriptural critique by revealing the tangible mechanisms that transformed theological claims into practical power. The Pope's genius lay in creating institutional structures that converted spiritual authority into functional control, deploying clerical appointments as a form of territorial infiltration more effective than military conquest. This ecclesiastical command structure represents history's most successful supranational organization, a system that maintained central control across diverse cultures and political regimes without requiring territorial contiguity or direct military occupation. The papal appointment system functioned as both a bureaucratic mechanism and a loyalty program, ensuring that local church leaders throughout Europe ultimately answered to Rome rather than their geographic sovereigns. Smith also identifies a crucial limitation to papal dominion: the successful resistance of France and England to Rome's appointment powers. The power of the Pope in the collation of the great benefices of the Church seems, before the Reformation, to have been nowhere so effectually and so universally restrained as in France and England. The Concordat afterwards, in the 16th century, gave to the kings of France the absolute right of presenting to all the great, or what are called the consistorial benefices of the Gallican Church. Smith's observation reveals the critical vulnerability in the papal system, which is the dependence on appointment rights that could be contested by determined monarchs. While popes commanded a transnational clerical network throughout Europe, the French and English crowns managed to secure exceptional control over ecclesiastical appointments within their territories, weakening Rome's direct influence. The 1516 Concordat of Bologna marked a decisive shift in this power struggle, formalizing King Francis I's absolute right to nominate bishops and abbots throughout France. This arrangement created the distinctive Gallican Church, Catholic in doctrine but nationally controlled in administration. The French monarchy thereby captured the institutional machinery of the Church while maintaining its religious character, effectively nationalizing a branch of the papal system. This exceptional resistance reveals the sophisticated statecraft of Europe's Western monarchies, who recognized that controlling clerical appointments was essential to genuine sovereignty. By securing nomination rights to consistorial benefices, these kingdoms redirected clerical loyalties toward the crown, transforming potential papal agents into royal servants. Smith's insight illuminates why the French and English monarchies developed particularly strong national identities. Their assertion of appointment rights prevented the bifurcation of sovereignty that plagued other European territories. This ecclesiastical independence provided foundations for the nation-state by establishing the principle that even religious institutions within national boundaries must ultimately answer to national authority. The Concordat thus represents a pivotal moment in the limitation of papal power, the point at which Rome was forced to formally acknowledge the primacy of royal authority within national boundaries. This compromise foreshadowed the post-Westphalian system of territorial sovereignty that would eventually replace the medieval model of overlapping jurisdictions with the Pope as supranational sovereign. Smith then traces the remarkable transformation of the French clergy from devoted papal agents to stalwart defenders of royal sovereignty. Since the establishment of the Pragmatic Sanction and of the Concordat, the clergy of France have in general shown less respect to the decrees of the papal court than the clergy of any other Catholic country. In all the disputes which their sovereign has had with the Pope, they have almost constantly taken party with the former. This independency of the clergy of France upon the court of Rome seems to be principally founded upon the Pragmatic Sanction and the Concordat. The dramatic extent of this transformation becomes clear in Smith's historical contrast. In the earlier periods of the monarchy, the clergy of France appear to have been as much devoted to the Pope as those of any other country. During the reign of Robert II, 996-1031, papal excommunication wielded such spiritual terror that his own servants, it is said, threw the victuals which came from his table to the dogs, and refused to taste anything themselves which had been polluted by the contact of a person in his situation. These servants acted under clerical direction, taught to do so by the clergy of his own dominions, revealing the French Church's original function as enforcer of papal decrees against their own sovereign. This historical juxtaposition paints how thoroughly legal mechanisms governing appointments nationalized the French Church. The Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges, 1438, and subsequent Concordat, 1516, worked a revolution in clerical allegiance by redirecting the pathways of advancement. When bishops owed their positions to royal favor rather than papal appointment, their institutional self-interest naturally aligned with the crown. Smith's analysis reveals the fundamentally pragmatic character of ecclesiastical power. Beyond theology and tradition, the critical factor determining clerical loyalties was control over appointments and promotions. The French crown recognized that capturing the Church's institutional machinery was more effective than challenging its doctrines, an insight that would later shape Anglican approaches to Reformation. The French clergy's exceptional independence demonstrates how structural adjustments to appointment systems could effectively tame papal power without formal schism. This third way between Protestant rupture and ultramontane submission created a distinctively Gallican Catholicism, orthodox in doctrine yet nationally oriented in politics, balancing religious universalism with emerging state sovereignty. In his provocative work, The New World Order, researcher Ralph Epperson highlights an architectural oddity with profound symbolic implications for papal authority. The Masons have admitted that they use symbols to conceal important truths from their fellow Masons. One of these symbols is the obelisk. The word is defined by a dictionary as a tall, four-sided stone pillar tapering toward its pyramidal top. There are three of major importance in the world today. One in Washington, D.C., called the Washington Monument, another one in Central Park, in New York City, and the third in the Vatican, located in Rome, Italy. The first major obelisk is in St. Peter's Square in Rome, Italy, and is placed in such a way that every pope who addresses any crowd in the square must face the obelisk. The Vatican obelisk occupies the geometric center of Bernini's Grand Colonnade, forming the focal point of St. Peter's Square. Originally erected at Heliopolis for the Egyptian sun god Ra, then moved to Rome by Emperor Caligula in 37 CE. This monument represents one of history's most remarkable symbolic appropriations. Under Pope Sixtus V in 1586, it was relocated to its current position and consecrated with a bronze cross, containing a relic of the true cross. When the Pope appears on the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica for blessings and addresses, the ancient Egyptian monument stands between him and the gathered faithful, a physical intermediary in the sacred geography of papal authority. This placement creates a sightline where the pontiff, pagan monument, and Christian community align in a straight visual axis. The obelisk exemplifies the Vatican's sophisticated approach to symbolism, absorbing pre-Christian elements while transforming their meaning through context and consecration. What once honored Ra now stands topped with a cross, its solar associations reinterpreted within Christian cosmology. This arrangement reveals the complex layering of symbols within papal ceremonial space. The Egyptian monument, now Christianized, occupies the literal center of Catholicism's most important public square. A testament to the Church's ability to incorporate and repurpose powerful symbols from earlier religious traditions while maintaining doctrinal continuity. Epperson also reveals a stunning anti-papal animus at Freemasonry's highest levels through Albert Pike's writings about the Knights Templar. The order of the temple Mr. Pike was writing about was the Knights Templar, which was, according to him, devoted to the cause of opposition to the tiara, the Pope's triple crown, and the crowns of kings. Mr. Pike said that the Catholic Church was a power of evil because it had crushed the Templars, even though he admitted that they were devoted to opposition to the Church and its leader, the Pope. But the major point of that quote is that these forces of opposition, presumably meaning the Masons, are marching onward toward the conquest of the world. This passage illuminates a hidden historical battle line. Pike, the sovereign Grand Commander of Scottish Rite Freemasonry and its preeminent theologian, frames the papacy as Masonry's primordial enemy. The medieval suppression of the Templars becomes, in Pike's retelling, the origin point of an ongoing vendetta against papal authority that extends into modern Freemasonry. Pike's characterization of the Templars as devoted to opposition to the tiara suggests a purposeful, organized resistance to papal authority. By identifying the papal triple crown specifically, Pike targets not just Catholic doctrine, but the Pope's claim to temporal, spiritual, and ecclesiastical sovereignty, precisely the tripartite authority that Masonry, with its alternative moral framework, implicitly challenges. The passage reveals a fascinating inversion. Pike condemns the Church as evil for crushing the Templars, while simultaneously acknowledging the Templars were dedicated to opposing that same Church. This circular logic exposes how deeply anti-papal sentiment is imprinted in Masonic mythology, where opposition to the papacy becomes self-justifying. Most alarming is Pike's assertion that these forces of opposition are marching onward toward the conquest of the world, framing Masonry's relationship to papal authority as an active campaign for global dominance. This positions the Pope and Freemasonry as competing claimants to universal authority, engaged in a centuries-long struggle beyond ordinary religious differences. This is an interesting counterpoint to conventional understandings of papal power. While Smith traced how secular states gradually constrained papal authority through legal mechanisms, Pike suggests a parallel, hidden challenge from esoteric brotherhoods, claiming spiritual succession from the suppressed Templars, with the papal tiara as their explicit target. The papal paradox persists precisely because it embodies fundamental tensions within Western civilization itself. This office that crowns men with claims of divine representation captures our deepest ambivalence about authority, our conflicted relationship with transcendent claims, and our simultaneous desire for and suspicion of spiritual certainty. The Pope embodies both what we seek and what we fear in ultimate authority. Definitive guidance and potential domination. History reveals the remarkable adaptability behind papal persistence. From Peter's simple apostolic authority to the dogmatic infallibility of the First Vatican, from territorial dominion to global moral influence, the papacy has reinvented itself repeatedly while maintaining claims to unchanging tradition. This institutional chameleonic ability to transform while claiming consistency explains its survival through civilizational upheavals that destroyed seemingly more powerful institutions. The papal office functions as both a mirror and a counterpoint to secular authority structures. While democratic systems increasingly distributed power downward, the papacy concentrated it upward, reaching its apotheosis of centralization in 1870, precisely as European monarchies declined. This inverse relationship reveals how papal authority often defined itself against prevailing political currents, offering alternative visions of legitimacy that transcend electoral mandates or military strength. The multidisciplinary perspectives examined reveal complementary truths. Jung's psychological analysis unveils how the Pope serves as a projected archetype of spiritual authority, an externalized symbol of internal spiritual principle. Spinoza's rational critique exposes the textual and logical inconsistencies behind papal claims to scriptural warrant. Smith's economic assessment reveals the sophisticated institutional mechanisms that translated theological claims into functional control across diverse cultures. Together, these perspectives illuminate how theological assertions manifested as practical power. Contemporary papal challenges reflect broader tensions in global society. The institution that once commanded armies now wields only moral suasion. The office that once crowned emperors now issues ethical appeals, easily ignored by secular powers. Yet paradoxically, this diminishment of temporal authority has corresponded with expanded global reach. The Pope's voice now can penetrate societies where medieval popes could never dream of influence. The most profound papal paradox remains theological, an office claiming divine guidance occupied by demonstrably fallible humans. This tension between vessel and content, between messenger and message, mirrors the central Christian mystery of incarnation, divinity clothed in humanity. Perhaps this explains why the papacy endures despite scandals, errors and abuses that would have destroyed lesser institutions. Whether viewed through theological, philosophical, psychological, or historical lenses, the papacy reveals something essential about human civilization. Our persistent desire to institutionalize transcendence, to give organizational form to spiritual experience, to bridge finite and infinite through tangible representation. As long as humanity seeks connection with the divine while living within earthly constraints, the papal paradox will continue to embody our deepest contradictions about authority, representation, and ultimate meaning.